Well, hello, beloved. It's Pastor Paul, and I am on vacation and very excited today for you all to have Jay Bates back in the pulpit, who filled in quite a lot previous to my coming here. He and I have not yet actually met yet. We've talked over email, but you know him well, and so we're glad to have him with us. So what I wanted to do just quickly is run through some context for today's passage, and as I usually do, and you know I like to create a little video for that when I'm not here. So here's what we've got today. Last week we were in John 11, which was the raising of Lazarus. We're going to skip over John 12, which is kind of unfortunate because a big piece of it is a really beautiful and important story of Jesus being anointed by Mary Magdalene. And the other piece that we're going to skip over, but we'll come back to on Palm Sunday, is Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. But so that leads us to John 13. And John 13 is a pretty famous passage, as it's the Maundy Thursday passage, the passage where Jesus washes his disciples' feet. You may be familiar with it and wondering, why are we reading this now? Well, this is kind of how the narrative lectionary works. Couple things about both this passage and Maundy Thursday. First of all, that word Maundy, it's not Monday. It's not Monday Thursday. It's Maundy Thursday, which is rooted in the Latin word mandatum, which is where we get our word mandate. So there's a way in which Maundy Thursday, or sometimes called Holy Thursday, is actually Mandate Thursday. And what it's really getting at is the new commandment that Jesus gives his disciples in chapter 13, verse 34, which we're not going to quite get to today, which reads, "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another." Loving one another is not a new commandment. The new part is, look at the way I've done it, and then you love each other that same way, which I think does tie back into the foot washing. That said, this also begins a 5-chapter dialogue, but mostly discourse of Jesus. 5 chapters of basically Jesus talking. A couple other things happen. If you put that in context of the whole gospel, that's about 25% of the gospel. This also is likely not the same scene as the communion scene in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There are a lot of similarities. They could be the same, but there are some inconsistencies in them if they are the same. Chief among them that you'll see in the beginning of this passage, it says that this was before the Passover and not on the Passover. So that is all I wanted to say about that, to set you up for John chapter 13. And so we will now proceed with our scripture reading. Have a wonderful day, beloved, and I'll see you when I get back on the 8th. Well, hello, beloved. It's Pastor Paul, and
the scripture reading today is John 13, verses 1 through 17. Now, before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already decided that Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, would betray Jesus. And during supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from supper, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "One who is bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him, and for this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." After he had washed their feet and put on his robe and had reclined again, He said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your teacher and Lord, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example that you also should do as I have done to you. Very truly, I tell you, slaves are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the ones who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them." The word of God for the people of God.
Good morning. It's good to see all of you again. If you've been here before when I preach, you know that sometimes I'll wander over here, sometimes I'll stand over here. Well, it's good to be with you this morning. And when I saw that this was the text for this morning, I kind of silently cursed the faculty over at Luther Seminary where I attend for my PhD, because they wrote this. They wrote this lectionary. The narrative lectionary comes from Luther Seminary, and it confused me in my head a bit because I haven't been working in churches for a little bit, and I said, "Is it already Maundy Thursday?" But it's not. It just scared me for a second, like, have I really lost all sense of time? No, but we have the Maundy Thursday text this morning, and this is a text that's kind of difficult to preach on because it's one of those texts that folks who have been going to church most of their life, or at least for a while, kind of have heard probably everything they think they could hear about feet washing. It's hard sometimes to take Holy Week texts or church holiday texts and find something new inside of it. You think, yes, I've heard it all. Jesus is humble before those, and he is a servant leadership, and we should all be servant leaders. La, 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 la. But I think that there's always something, hopefully a little bit new or a different way, a little bit sideways, turn it upside down, hop up and down on one foot, that you could hopefully find something a little bit unique every time you have to hear the same text over and over. Does anyone else in here, like me, when you hear the Bible talk about Jesus and his disciples, sort of just think of a couple favorite disciples? You don't think of all 12. Raise your hand if you sort of leave out a couple disciples when you think of who Jesus is talking to. Especially, we often don't think of Judas being in the room. Or perhaps we don't want to think about Judas being in the room. Raise your hand if you're like me, and when you hear the foot washing story, you often forget Judas is in the room, and that Judas has already planned to turn Jesus over. So I think a common way of talking about Jesus' foot washing, and a much more, not convenient, but just an easier way to think about that we often see, and there's pictures online, of course, that people have illustrated of Jesus just in a modern way, washing feet of those that we can sympathize with. It's easier to just think that when Jesus says to love one another as I have loved you, he just means to love those who have less than you, to love those who you already sympathize with, to wash the feet of all the other youth in your youth group that you already are friends with, to wash the feet of your family members who you love and who have never planned to kill you, hopefully. I guess that's not a given for everybody. But it's easier to imagine washing the feet of the people you already know love you and that you love. It's easier to think about washing the feet of your vulnerable neighbors who need your help. But it's really challenging to think about washing the feet of a man who has planned to kill you. And another man who you know will deny you and say, I've never met him. I don't know that guy. I don't follow Jesus. I've never been with him. I've never traveled with him. You didn't see me with him just the other day. It is harder to think about foot washing and what it means for Jesus to remove his robe, to wear a towel, and to kneel before the man who was about to turn him over to the authorities. And so today I thought we could focus all on Judas. I thought we could talk about Judas's life and what leads him to this moment. Judas is not possessed by some sudden otherworldly spirit that is making him turn Jesus over. At no point do we hear that Judas has suddenly been possessed to do this. This is a long time coming. And to understand how Judas ends up in this situation, and to understand why Judas might do this, we have to think a little bit harder about who Judas was. Does anyone in here know a ton about the biography of Judas? Anyone's special interest Judas? There are many people whose special interest, in fact, are some of the disciples. Many people have spent many years of their lives researching people like Matthew, Bartholomew, Matthias, Paul, all of the other disciples. And of course, there are scholars who study Judas, which is why we know anything about Judas. But rarely do you come upon someone who says, my favorite disciple was Judas. And so today, let's focus on Judas. Because there are people like Judas in our communities. There are people like Judas in our families. There are people like Judas we will come across many points in our lives. Judas was one of the only disciples who was a Judean. Why does that matter? All of the other disciples were Galileans. Why does that matter? Because Judeans and Galileans lived very different lives. So if you forget a little bit about the geography, or if you can't imagine it in your head, Judea has Jerusalem and is in the south. Separating Judea and Galilee is Samaria, right? Famously known for being an area that both Galileans and Judeans hate. And there's a bunch of other Hellenistic property between these two areas, formerly separate kingdoms. And because Jerusalem is located in Judea, and Judea is ruled directly by Rome, the Jews who lived in Judea were much more violently oppressed, much more directly overseen and living under the thumb of Roman rule. Those who lived in Galilee lived a slightly more free life. They were able to live under, sort of that satellite king, Herod, right? But still mostly being able to find some sort of compromise between Roman rule and Jewish life. Galileans, because they were separated by so much land, and they lived in such a different area, and they didn't have Jerusalem, they were not as strict in their religious observance. Many Judeans looked down on Galileans for not being as Jewish as them. Right? Sometimes as modern Christians, we look back on and we hear this word Jewish or Jew from this time, and we think they're all the same. They're all experiencing the same life. They're all being oppressed in the same way. They all believe the same things. They all practice the same way. And that's not true. Judeans and Galileans had deep rifts in the way that they practiced, in the way that they understood themselves as Jews, in the way that they understood the presence of Roman rule. And so Judas had grown up and been formed by that difference. But he's traveling and he is doing life with these 11 other men and Jesus who were not formed by a Judean life, who had not experienced the exact things that he had experienced, who did actually not have the same exact politics that he had. Judas walked through all of the texts we hear about Judas walking through with a different mindset than many of the other disciples. He had experienced and seen more brutal things, perhaps, than his Galilean counterparts. And so, many scholars believe that a lot of this led Judas to be disillusioned with Jesus' open-handedness for Gentiles. That Judas began to say, this thing I thought was for us. Many scholars have found evidence that Judas was associated with essentially a nationalist movement. That Judas wanted to establish a physical kingdom now that was only for Jews. Because for so long he had experienced the trauma of what it means to live under another culture. And he saw the erosion in his mind, the erosion of his religion. In his mind, that also meant the erosion of his culture and of his people. Judas had been radicalized in many ways into a political nationalist. But it came from somewhere, it didn't just appear inside his mind. And so scholars have different ways of understanding Judas's betrayal of Jesus. There is no one exact correct way, although many scholars work hard to make it clear Judas was not simply just greedy for money. That often leads us towards anti-Semitism, in which we believe Jews are greedy, right? That forms anti-Semitic views. And so scholars have done a lot of work to say, no, Judas did not just hand Jesus over for the silver, although he receives it. My brain just blanked on the word for it. Judas is, what is the word? Oh no. You know, you hate when your brain does that. His motives. Good Lord. On a Sunday morning, I forgot the word motives. Judas's motives were likely political in nature. Were likely about feeling that Jesus was not bringing this physical kingdom fast enough. That Jesus, and to some of this might sound crazy, that Jesus was not political enough. Judas wanted Jesus essentially to bring a holy war. Judas did not hand over Jesus because he no longer believed Jesus was the Messiah. Some scholars think, in fact, that it was Judas's fervent belief that Jesus was the Messiah that led him to hand Jesus over. That he felt that if Jesus was arrested by the Roman authorities, it would force Jesus to finally use his amazing power to defeat Rome. That if he had been arrested, he would be forced and backed into a corner to finally kill the Roman army and establish the kingdom on earth. Because what Judas thought Jesus meant about establishing a kingdom was that it was only going to be for those that Judas believed deserved that kingdom. And when he started to hear these curious, weird things from Jesus, it started to imply it wasn't just for Judeans and Galileans, that it was also for those who were potentially Roman centurions, who were Greek and Roman, for those who were living in Asia, and for those all across the empire. Gentiles. And this would have offended Judas far more than it would have offended any of the other disciples. And so, Judas's trauma likely drove him to what we might call extremism. He wanted political expediency rather than the true and full transformation of people. He was interested in the good things Jesus had to speak about as long as it freed only the Jews, only his kin. And so we have a Judas who hands Jesus over. But before he does that, though after he's planned to do that, he goes and he sits for a meal with Jesus, and he has his feet washed. And if you notice in the text we have today, Jesus doesn't let him off scot-free. He doesn't say, like, all of you are clean except Judas, but he says, all of you are clean. He says, not all of you are clean, right? He names that there are people in the room who might do unspeakable things, but that some of them have already planned to do unspeakable things. And the long monologue kind of speech that Pastor Paul was talking about, that following this text, is that Jesus washes their feet and then for a very long time details how the people in the room are not clean. He predicts the betrayal and the denial, and that's when he tells Peter, "You will deny me." So it's not that Jesus never confronts the elephant in the room. It's not that Jesus wants us to push things under the rug and pretend they don't happen for the sake of love. That's not what the gospel is encouraging us towards. But it is challenging us to think about the fact that Jesus takes his robe off and kneels down, not just in front of needy people who are humble and who are loving and who are sort of lovable, but that Jesus puts down his robe and kneels in front of and washes the feet of a man who we would probably label very unlovable. He's doing a very unloving and unlovable thing. But as we know from the context I've gave about Judas's life, he doesn't end up there on accident. There are things along his life. So as an illustration, I thought I'd talk a little bit about a man named Michael Kent. Has anyone ever heard that name before, Michael Kent? Maybe you'll recognize this story when I mention it. Michael Kent is a former neo-Nazi. He grew up in, I think he grew up in Colorado. Certainly was in prison in Colorado and then ended up in this situation in Colorado. For 20 years, Michael Kent had been part of a neo-Nazi organization in the United States. He has a long legal record of many violent crimes. And after one of his stints in prison, he was assigned a parole officer named Tiffany Whittier. Tiffany Whittier is a black woman. Worked for she's a parole officer in the city that he was in Colorado. And Michael Kent said, "This is whatever, every parole officer, who cares? I'm just going to end up back in prison." Which is the mindset of many who have unfortunately had recidivism, because often the parole system doesn't work. So he said, whatever, they'll send me a parole officer, who cares? This parole officer won't be any help, and I'll go back to prison. He had no intention of changing his way of life. But Tiffany Whittier came to his door, knocked on it, showed up for his first appointment, and to his surprise, she was a black woman. And he said, "Don't they know what I was in prison for?" "Whatever, it's my parole officer." And he asked her, "Do you know what I was in prison for?" She said, "Yes. And I don't care. I'm here as your parole officer." And she returned with regularity, unlike other parole officers. And she developed a relationship with Michael Kent, unlike other parole officers. And this was much to his chagrin. He had no intention of changing. But they developed a relationship that he had never had with any other parole officer. He said that the thing that changed him, that Tiffany Whittier did, that no other parole officer had ever done, was that she expressed care about him as a human being. She had taken the time to slow down and say, "Michael, I care about what happens to you. You can't go on like this." And they developed a friendship. And that might sound like one of those sort of, whatever, like a tiger becomes friends with a little duck, and it's like it doesn't feel like it really means anything for the rest of our world. But it does. Michael Kent and Tiffany's story, they go on to participate in deprogramming work that happens in the United States. Their story is a meaningful subject of a lot of other types of social sciences research that shows us some of the most effective ways of deprogramming people from extremism and why people end up in extremist movements in the first place. And what research shows us is that much like Judas, people often end up in extremist movements because of trauma. Michael Kent had experienced a lot of trauma. And that trauma led to anger and hate, and to closed-fistedness about the world and others that said, if I'm going to experience anything good, it should only be for people like me. And honestly, a viewpoint that says, I'm unlikely to experience anything good, and so why should anyone else? And what Jesus' foot washing does is challenge that with an open-handedness about love that says, I love you, even though I know you're going to murder me, and there's nothing you can do about it. It doesn't transform Judas. Judas ends up dying, right? We know that, before he's redeemed. But what he experienced before he dies is a radical and abundant love that he has to sit with until he dies. He doesn't get off scot-free, and in fact, Richard Rohr describes hell as actually the burning grief that you did not accept an abundant love that was for you. That deep grieving feeling that says, someone loved me so much, and instead I hated them. Instead I turned them down. Instead I turned them away. So that's how Richard Rohr kind of describes the quote-unquote burning of hell. But what we see all around us every day still, though, is people living with that close-fistedness. And they didn't end up there on accident. Hurt people. Have you heard that before? Hurt people. And there's a theology from where I'm from in Korea that essentially says sinned against people, sin against others. That is the cycle of sin. And so to attack sort of and resolve what sin is, you first have to wonder, where are people hurting? Why are people sinning against other people in the first place? Sinned against people, sin against others. And so this action Jesus does towards Judas, I love you and there's nothing you can do about it sort of thing. There's a black pastor in the South who was assigned to a congregation that was not happy he was there. They were a white congregation, and they made it very known to him they were not happy he was there. And every service, every Sunday, he started with, I love you, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so we are living in a time in a city where it is hard to imagine certain kinds of people getting their feet washed. And it's much easier in our head to say Jesus would kneel before our immigrant neighbors and wash their feet. Absolutely, he would. It is much harder to say that Jesus, too, would take his robe off and kneel in front of an ICE officer, in front of the president, in front of your neighbors who are not perhaps Judas, but are Peter, who are saying, yeah, no, I'm just sort of turning the other way. I don't know about this. I don't know about love and sort of justice. I'm just, it's just about the law, right? People who are like Peter. Much, much harder, and I don't have a solution for you today. My job is not to create your solution, but it's to just simply invite you to consider what it means that Judas was in the room where it happened. And not only was he in the room, but he had his feet washed too. And if you're not convinced sort of by stories and affectionate language, to consider that studies and research back it up, that a much more effective way to deprogram people out of hate is relationship, love, peer-to-peer engagement, nonviolent communication. It is not shame. It is not logic. It is not numbers. It is not superiority. And it's not even education. Oftentimes it is relationship. So Judas doesn't live long enough to be redeemed. But we today get to live with understanding that a man who is not redeemed still received deep, abundant love. And so what now is a faithful response? What now in our world can we do to look into the face of those who persecute us and our neighbors and say, I love you, and there is nothing you can do about it? For myself, as someone who's an immigrant who's been living in this city in this time, I thought, what would I do if an ICE agent pulled me over? What would I do if an ICE agent stopped me while I was walking my dog or driving to school? Would I try to fight? Would I flee? Would I sort of roll over and like fawn? I'd be like, oh my gosh, how's your day going? You're so great. You seem really cool. Like, we should hang out sometime. Or would I try to kind of de-escalate? Could I muster the energy inside of myself to try and de-escalate? Would I be able to have a moment where I look at an ICE officer and in not so many words say, I love you and there's nothing you can do about it, even if I end up down at Whipple? So those are the things we wrestle with as we hear the gospel. Not the easy way out of just washing the feet of the people you already love, but of washing feet of people that you know have done terrible, not just disagreeable, but abhorrent things. That is the gospel we live with. And it sucks, doesn't it? Sometimes it sucks. That's all you can say about it. But it is the faithful way we're encouraged to consider living. So I invite you to consider that. How do you live in a time when there are many people like Judas? And what is your faithful response? What will be your faithful response when there might be a time in the not so near future that those beat down and overworked ICE agents say, I need a way out and I don't know where to find it? Or they're willing to admit, I'm doing this work. And how do you respond? If you encounter someone at the grocery store or in small talk, what might be your response? How might you engage that person where they are? Amen. I'll invite you now to join us in the responsive hymn, which is in your bulletin and is hymn number 2222.